This morning. My name is Julia Gaspar-Bates. I am on the board of directors for SIETAR USA. And just for those of you who are guests and are not yet members of SIETAR, I'd like to invite you to share any questions that you have about the organization. We're happy to help you and provide any details. We've started to do these webinars about a year ago now on a monthly basis, and are really welcoming our members to present. So if any of you also have any presentations or topics that are of particular interest, please feel free to contact us and let us know, and we'll look forward to that in the future. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Tatyana Fertelmeyster, who many of you probably know. She has been with SIETAR for many, many, many years. She's a past president of SIETAR USA. She's held positions on the board, and she was also a conference chair. And Tatyana is originally from Russia, and I think that with Russia being in the news so much these days, it seemed very apt that we would be able to invite Tatyana to provide more of an insider's perspective on Russia. So would like to, without further ado, invite her to start speaking, and also just would like to share that this will be somewhat interactive. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Tatyana will periodically be asking if there are any questions, and I'll field those to her during the presentation. And we'll also allow about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so you can unmute your phones at that time or use the chat box. Okay, thanks very much. And Tatyana, it's handing the floor over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Just a technical question. Are we recording this webinar? Just for people to know if it will be.
Yes, I believe we are. Yes, Karen, I think that she's doing that. And also, I just want to reiterate as well that Tatyana has agreed to share her slides for this. So, so we will be sharing those to those of you who are on this, this webinar.
Great. Great, thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. I am excited to be here with you, and I'm excited to talk today about Russia in a little bit of a different way, because when Russia is in the news so much, it becomes kind of a concept rather than a country that has its own complicated history and complicated reality and all kinds of things happening. So I want to make sure that we will look at Russia to some degree in its complexity today, but also with the focus on understanding what and how is happening between Russia and the United States, between Russia and the rest of the world. Let me tell you about the slide that you are looking at right now. A couple of things about it. I'll tell you about what's on the slide, but first I'll tell you about how this slide was put together. I added it this morning about 15 minutes before I went online, and that goes in the best of Russian historical traditions. In 19th century, Russian women of high society had this kind of rule of dress for the ball being finished on them already. So I'm wearing my dress and the last stitches are made right there, and that was called the dress from a needle. So something that is just made immediately for that occasion. So I like to operate in the dress from the needle kind of way as a facilitator, because you never know what the last moment idea would be. So what you see here are two pictures, one that is dated just a few days ago, the one that has Joseph Stalin right in the middle of it, and the other is about maybe half a year old, maybe 9 months old. So the picture with Stalin was made a few days ago when Russia was celebrating victory in Europe Day, 74th anniversary of it. And a lot of kind of glorifying of the victory, glorifying of the war is going on, including glorifying characters like Stalin, and Russians are still arguing if he was a mass murderer or an effective manager. So here is this kind of snapshot of the moment for you. The other picture, you see really kind of interesting crowd of young people, including the girl who is kind of covered in the LGBT pride flag, which is a risky thing to do. In Russia, there is a special law against propaganda of LGBTQ lifestyle. So here is this girl and all the other young people, and this is a demonstration to protest pension reform. Russian government has been pushing the pension reform recently, making the retirement age higher. And they made it 65 years for men and 60 years for women. Men don't often live to the age of 65 in Russia. So this reform generated a lot of protest, and the two slogans that you see here presented by these young people, the woman is holding one that says, Putin, when are you going to retire? And the other one is, this is not a reform, this is a robbery. So as you see, there are all kinds of things happening in Russia. It is not a monolith, as sometimes is tempting to kind of think. Okay, this is interesting. My computer doesn't want to cooperate with me. Okay, it looks like it works. Just a reminder for you that your questions are very important. Julia will be keeping track of questions that you ask and comments that you're making. We'll leave time at the end of this 90-minute session to answer your questions, but also I will ask Julia as I go if there are questions that need to be responded to right away, or she can just step in and say, you know, there is some clarification needed. So we'll keep it as kind of based on your questions as we can in this format. So please do not hesitate to ask.
And Tatyana, we already have a question that's come in from Jenny as well. So
okay.
After you perhaps give your introduction, I'll just share that. She wanted to know how you describe friendships in Russia and how you would start a friendship. Okay,
we will get to it. I will definitely talk about Russian friendships. This is me. Me in color is few years ago in Moscow. 2011 was the last time I visited Russia. In 2011, 2012 is when things went seriously downhill politically and in many other ways. That's when Putin came back to be a president for his third term, just because the constitution says 2 consecutive terms and doesn't say kind of 2 consecutive terms only. And that's when, you know, things really changed for Russia and foreign business started kind of leaving the country. The picture on the left is me 30 years ago. This is my exit visa. This is a piece of paper that we got after we gave back to the government our citizenship and paid 700 rubles on the top of every passport, which means every person in the family who is 16 and older. So my then husband and I were 2 adults in the family. We returned our citizenship. We paid our $1,400 rubles, I'm sorry. And just to give you a sense of it, at that time, my husband's engineering salary was 200 rubles a month. And that's how we became people without the state, stateless people, till we got a green card in the United States, where we came after being accepted as refugees. So here on this slide, you have all the contact information for me. Currently, I am a proud owner of a consulting company called Connecting Differences. And my approach to work is wherever there are people, there are differences. So one of the differences that I often explore in my work is the difference between Russian culture and American culture, as well as some other cultures. So I want to start us off with understanding kind of how I approach differences and how I would suggest you approach differences in your thinking about the information that I am sharing with you today. You all went to school, you all had geometry class, you all learned Euclid's geometry, in which main surface is flat, in which the shortest distance between two dots is a straight line, parallel lines don't cross. So there are a few axioms, a few kind of given pieces that you just have to accept. This is the way it is. And everything else is then built from there, and things make sense for us. And we live in this world that is built this way. And if any of you have ever been to the Museum of Modern Art in Denver, you know how much we rely on Euclid geometry. In that building, except for the first floor, there are no two walls that are parallel to each other. And I was kind of feeling seasick walking through it, because my body needs parallel walls and the walls perpendicular to the floor. So here is another approach to geometry offered to the world by the Russian mathematician Lobachevsky, couple hundred years ago or so. And at that time, his geometry, where parallel lines can eventually cross, and surface is not flat, but more of the saddle, at that time, it wasn't making much sense. However, as human beings went into space, turns out that's where the geometry of Lobachevsky works, absolutely. So I want us to kind of ground ourselves in this recognition of the fact that whatever we take as a given, whatever we take as our axioms, building the system from there is making sense. Comparing the systems often comes with the question, how can something like this make sense? So it's very applicable for interculturalists in kind of the way we think about the world. So I can't run this program without mentioning the fact that Russia has been in the news for at least last couple of years in regards to its hacking into our election system in multiple ways, many of which have been identified. Some, who knows, might still not be known. And as we are going into next elections, it's definitely a great concern, to see what is happening and what will be happening. We also now know that Russian hand was there in kind of pushing Brexit, and again, who knows what else. It is definitely a government-supported thing. absolutely, unquestionably. Even though when one time, you know, one of many times when Putin was asked about it, he just said something like, you know, we have all these bright people and many of them, you know, like programming, and so somebody feels patriotic and they wake up in the morning and they kind of go hacking. It's kind of a wonderful position that doesn't hold water, but that's how he kind of spoke about it. I also wanted to show you this thing just because I find it to be so wonderfully ridiculous that it cannot not be shared. So this is a picture that comes from a limited edition of a paper bag, and it's a paper bag that was created for the company called Tulsky Sakhar, or Tula is the city nearby Moscow, and so this is Tula Sugar. Company is called Tula Sugar, and they had a special limited edition of sugar bags, 1 kilo sugar bag, that says the 45th president of the United States has just been elected, and it's Donald Trump. What does that have to do with sugar? I'm not sure, but that just shows you how much a couple years ago or 3 years ago, so Russian propaganda, not only messing around here, but also internally for its own people, was kind of hyping it up, how, you know, we will have our own president in the White House, meaning, you know, somebody who will support our cause. I will introduce today a number of Russian phrases, and one of the most favorite thing of mine about Russian culture, and that is a wonderful Russian humor, Russian ability to really turn humor in the survival mechanism under different governments and under different historical circumstances. So this is just one of these ways in which Russians joke about themselves, saying that Russia is a country with the unpredictable past. Because rewriting of the past, rewriting of the history books, happens quite regularly, as does rewriting of the Constitution and rewriting of all kinds of laws, because everybody who is in power, with very rare exceptions in Russia, really strives to get as much power, as complete of a power as possible, and rewriting history becomes one of the important mechanisms for it. So making Russia great again. The picture here says, we'll bring everything back in the funny way that I can't really adequately translate, but the meaning is, you know, we'll bring everything back. And the poem that I really like comes from a very famous Russian poet of 19th century, Fyodor Tyutchev, who says, Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone. No ordinary yardstick can span her greatness. She stands alone, unique. In Russia, one can only believe. And this believe in Russia and believe in its messianic role has always been quite great in Russia. Okay. Julie, do we have any questions that I need to know about at this point?
Yeah, we have another question that came in about the generations. So wanted to know what events or events have marked the generations, and what starts the baby boomers generation in Russia, the millennials and so forth.
Okay.
And maybe if you can also address that at some point, that would be great.
I will, absolutely. And in some ways, the slide that I am going to share right now has a lot to do with that, because in every generation there are certain historic events that make this generation more than any other event in the life of the same 20 or so years that make a generation. So I'll acknowledge the dates and then maybe talk about generational reality of that. So 1917 is the year of the October Revolution. It used to be called Great October Socialist Revolution. Now they're talking about it as October Revolt, because again, Russia is rethinking its history. As a result of this revolution, Russian monarchy ended. Russian Tsar and his family were killed about a year after the revolution in 1918. Now that Russia is living in its post-Soviet reality, and the Orthodox Church is back full force when it was kind of dormant during the years of the Soviet Union. Nicholas II is now considered to be a Russian saint. And so the revolution is not a revolution anymore, but kind of an October revolt. So there was not much of a celebration a couple years ago when it was the 100th anniversary. But there are still very much powers in Russia, and you saw one of the picture with Stalin and all that, who are really pushing for return to this revolutionary past. 1937 is the year that is most known in Russia for one of the biggest Stalin's purges, when a lot of people were killed, or people were in prison. That's when Gulag started big time. And we know Gulag as a system of labor camps and system of really kind of repressions, but it was also a big part of Stalin's economic kind of program. He saw that as a source of free labor, people who can do all kinds of hard work and don't need to be paid for it. So in a sense, when we think about the system of private prisons, we can think about how that looks like when it is done on the larger scale. Stalin was there before Hitler ever thought about using his camps this way. In 1941, World War II was already going. It was going since September 1st of 1939. It's a very well-known fact now that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed by Molotov for the Soviet Union and Ribbentrop for Hitler's Germany, pact about kind of peace and non-aggression between these two countries, allowed for the World War II to start, for Europe to be divided. Definitely Poland was divided between Soviet Union and Germany, and then Soviet army took over Baltics as well, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. At the same time, things didn't work exactly as was predicted, so the war still started. For Russia, and historians are arguing about, did Stalin want to attack first and Hitler just outran him? So there's all kinds of questions in history, but whichever way it went, in 1941, June 22nd, 1941, the war started actually for the Soviet Union. The border was crossed, And the next few years, till May of 1945, the Soviet Union was officially at war, and that part of World War II in Russia is referred to as Great Patriotic War. And then all sorts of things happened after that, definitely. I don't have all these dates here, but in 1991, the thing that nobody would ever predicted happened. Soviet Union fell apart. The promise of democracy came. The great enthusiasm of American and in general Western business came. And for a while it felt that Russia might be changing. Unfortunately, right now it doesn't look that it is changing in a way as it once tried, in the direction of being a part of the larger world. And that is a separate and very long conversation about what happened and how it happened. But the thing that we are dealing with right now is the reality of the 2014, when Russian government decided to take over Crimea. Crimea was a part of Russian Empire and then became a part of the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, nobody bothered much, is it a part of this or that, because it was really all one thing. But at some point in the early 1960s, I think, Khrushchev decided to officially assign Crimea to Ukraine, because it actually has a land connection to Ukraine. It's a peninsula with a land connection to Ukraine. And there have been all kinds of feelings in Russia about it. And also when Soviet Union fell apart, that became a big issue, because Russian Black Sea Fleet, in a sense, was now parked in Ukraine. So in 2014, Putin decided to take Crimea, pretending for a while that Russia had nothing to do with it, that just people of Crimea, voted for it. And then at some point he said, yes, sure, definitely, we were there. And 2014, an annexation of Crimea cut Russia apart pretty much the same as 2016 elections did in the United States. It broke friendships, it broke families, it broke long-term, stable connections, depending on what side of the issue are you on, how do you see that. So let me tell you a little bit about the generations here. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was born in 1900. So in 1917, she was a part of a generation for whom revolution was their big thing. It broke Russia in so many different ways. There were people of that generation who ended up leaving Russia. There were people of that generation who were killed in a civil war. There were people of this great generation that stayed, but that was pretty much the first generation that came into its adulthood in the Soviet Union. My parents were born in 1924, the year when Lenin died. My mother was called Lenina to commemorate his name. My father was called Yulen, Юный Ленинец, young Leninist, again to commemorate his name. My parents were 13 years old at the time of Great Purge. They were a part of a generation that was sitting in Moscow and other places with their parents, not going to sleep, not knowing on whose door they will be knocking tonight. Many of that generation saw their parents being taken away and never brought back. It was also a generation that saw a great degree of change in the country. Industrialization was happening. Huge changes in this Russian agricultural system that was happening. Russian agriculture used to be pretty much, you know, villages and farmers and people having their own kind of farm going. Soviet system pushed everybody into collective farms. People who were doing better than others were accused in kind of exploiting everybody else, and many of them were sent to these labor camps. Many of them lost their lives in this process. So the agricultural system was pretty much destroyed and then made into something completely different, in some parts successfully, in many parts not successfully at all. My parents were finishing their high school in 1941 when war first started. My father, as soon as he graduated, which was maybe a year or so after the war started, volunteered to be drafted into the army. He and his friend volunteered together. Neither one of them were sort of a draft material, because my father had a bad heart. He was born with bad heart. His friend had flat feet. So in the best Russian ingenuity and creativity way, my father passed, you know, a feet exam for under his friend's name, and his friend passed EKG under my father's name. So that brought both of them into the army. My father's friend was kicked out very quickly, because definitely you can show somebody else's feet, but you have to walk on your own. And my father ended up being artillery lieutenant, and he became, he was injured. He became a war invalid. He lost an eye, but at least, you know, he kept his life, which made my being born possible. So in 1945, when the war ended, Soviet Union was victorious. Soviet Union went into redivision of Europe with its allies. And that sense of victory was not really felt by Russians in the sense of kind of hardships of their lives for quite a while. So the post-war generation, something that would be called baby boomers today, was definitely, and that is my generation, there was definitely a baby boom, you know, to the degree possible, but definitely not to the same degree as you saw in the United States and in many other places. Russia just lost millions and millions and millions of people. Russia lost these millions of people in the war. Russia also lost millions of people to Stalin's perjuries. So bringing, and those are not equal opportunity events, kind of. Definitely a lot of women lost their lives, but it was disproportionately men who didn't come back, or who came back so badly damaged by their experiences that they could not necessarily, you know, participate in having, you know, building families and all that. So shortage of people starts in Russia, shortage of men especially starts in Russia. All kinds of policies for, you know, supporting families with multiple children starts in Russia, trying to kind of build it up. And at that time, we are not talking Russia, we are talking Soviet Union. So there are definitely some places in the Soviet Union, for example, Central Asia, where people traditionally would have more children. But as we are looking at the situation today, the next generation, the generation of my children, the generation of late 80s, early 90s, is kind of a lost generation in Russia, because as Soviet Union fell apart and it was not clear what do we do, where we go, how do we teach, what do we teach, and at that time there are some people who are making it really big and become obscenely rich. There are some people, many people, who become equally obscenely poor, and then there are some people kind of in the middle. And what starts in this post-Soviet time is what you see in many places in the world right now. People are trying to invest as much as they can in their children's education. And the current generation in Russia is very much, current young generation, is very much divided based on socio-economic realities, parents who could and parents who could not kind of invest in their children. And starting at 2014, things are becoming difficult again, because that's when all kinds of sanctions are put in. That's when it becomes harder for Russians to be wherever they want to be and send their children, you know, to live and study overseas, even, you know, the Russians who have money to do that. So the generation that is growing up right now is the generation that actually quite often participates in protests. It's a generation that got a feeling in the beginning of its young life that things can be different, and now that they're kind of turning back in the familiar direction of repressions and limitations, they're the ones often protesting. And at the same time, there is a huge push for militarization of their kind of mentality and militarization of the young generation. So these are the pictures of a few days ago. You see kindergarten and daycare kids dressed in the you know, military uniforms of World War II. It's a military parade of preschoolers in the city of Petigorsk, with the city mayor, or whatever his position is, kind of receiving the parade. So that militarization, I think, is quite troubling and frightening, because this is the way you get people grow up with an idea that war is something that we do, that we've been victorious before, and that's what we do, we'll be victorious again. So there is this big desensitization to the horror of war, and instead this glorification of war that is happening right now, and they're really grabbing for a young generation as early as they can. This is an interesting date in Russian history, 1861, when slavery was abolished in Russia. In Russia, slavery was called serfdom, but otherwise it's very similar to American slavery, with one difference, that America brought people from elsewhere to enslave them. Russia enslaved its own people based on the kind of land ownership. You live on my land, you are now my slave kind of process that happened. And it lasted for about 300 years, so timeline very similar to the American slavery timeline. Many of you know Chekhov, Anton Chekhov, one of the very famous Russian writers and playwrights. Here is from the letter that he writes. Why don't you write about this young man squeezing drop by drop the slave out of himself and waking one fine morning feeling that real human blood, not slaves, is flowing in his veins. And as I'm thinking about it today, it's not just about those who were slaves need to squeeze the slave blood out of themselves to become fully free. It is very much about the slave owners, because a slave owner is enslaved by the system not less than a slave is, because that is their worldview. This is the way they understand the world. So if we are talking about, privileges that people have historically, how do you squeeze that out of yourself to give space to this new blood? It's really difficult, turns out. Here is the quote from Valery Zorkin, who is he is a Chief Justice of the Russian Constitutional Court. It's like the highest court of the land. And that's what he writes about slavery. With all its problematic sides, with all its negative sides, serfdom was the main connector that kept internal unity of the nation together. And that quote goes back to 2016. So 60 years after slavery was abolished, the Chief Justice of the land talks about serfdom, slavery, as something that was so profound in keeping a nation and its unity together. It is terrifying, because what we see in Russia today, as Russia went practically overnight from society where everybody was at least supposed to be sort of equal. Definitely it was an illusion of real equality, but some degree of it was there. Overnight, practically, Russia went into being a society with obscenely rich on one end and super poor on the other end. At least around 20% of Russian population today lives below their official poverty line, and they keep moving poverty line to change the numbers, but every time they move it, it comes back to the same pretty quickly. And in Russia today, if I have money, I'm everything, and if you don't have money, you're nothing. And you can see a lot of that treatment between people that's happening. And what is also happening, and that is speaking of generations, there is a big concern among Russians who actually made it. How do we hold it in the family? How do we make sure that our children inherit it? And it is one thing when you made a lot of money because you created something and kind of it comes out of your own abilities and you started a business or whatever. It's another when your wealth is based on your ability to kind of be a corrupt official. How do you leave that to your children? They're doing it a lot. A lot of people who are taking important positions in Russia today, whether they are qualified or not, are kind of children of those who want to preserve it for for them. Very much connected with this mentality is the very famous Russian approach. Я начальник, ты дурак, ты начальник, я дурак. I'm a boss, you are a fool. You are a boss, I'm a fool. You see it quite often in the workplace. You see it in many other interactions. So it's alive and well. I want to just very briefly address a few things that are relevant for us today. And one of these things is about kind of Russia being busy restoring its glory in different places in the world, whether it is in Ukraine or in Syria, or now Venezuela is coming next. I'm sure Russia will be involved in Iran if, God forbid, something starts there. And at the same time, it's always this pretense that we have nothing to do with anything. So the idea of fake news is very familiar to Russians. And I'll give you just one example that has nothing to do with anything international, but is useful to understand. Some of you might know the idea of Potemkin's village. It goes back in history. The story is that Catherine the Great wanted to see how Russian people live, and she went as far as saying, I want to kind of ride through Russia and look around. She sent one of her favorites, Potemkin, to take care of travel arrangements, and he created what's called, or not called, what's called in history Potemkin's village. It's kind of 18th century Hollywood, nice looking facades along the road for emperors to enjoy her ride. What you are looking at right now is the Potemkin's village of 2013. I think it's a city of Suzdal, not far from Russia, one of the famous, historically famous, beautiful, with its old churches and all sorts of other old architecture. And Putin was supposed to visit Suzdal, and local authorities looked around and realized, as back in old story, that he wouldn't like what he would see. And so they created this Potemkin's village. You see on the right, kind of how that building really looks, the back wall of the building. And you see on the left how they covered these old walls with banners. And banners were different. I had a picture somewhere, I couldn't find it today, where there is even a cat that's drawn on this banner. So they created that Potemkin's village, and Putin didn't even come to visit. I just wonder how much of the city money went into that. I also want to introduce a few Russian words, because understanding culture through its words and through its sayings, I think, is very useful. One of the most important words to understand for Russia is inakomyslie, the thinking differently. This is a really bad word. It goes back to Russian Orthodox tradition, what you know in English as Russian Orthodox Church. In Russian, it's called pravoslavie, two roots, pravy, correct, right, and slavit, to praise. So we have a right way to praise God, so to speak. And if you praise God differently, you are inakomyslishi, you think differently, you could be kicked out of church or even executed in old times. Now this word applies more to, and not only now, through the Soviet time and now again, inakomyslishi is the one who thinks differently from the party line, who does not agree with the government, who doesn't agree with the main kind of perspective. And it's not that Russians are all thinking the same thing. Russians are very, very creative people. But here is the example from business. Some years ago, a Russian psychologist and American business consultant wrote a book together that was called Overcoming Red Tape. And in this book, they've done a lot of research of Russian business in the 90s when it was just opening, to the world. And in one of the surveys, there is a manager who answers the question, what is a really good meeting? And he says a really good meeting is the one in which everybody agreed with the right idea suggested by me. So again, the same thing, if you think like I think, it's good. If you think differently, that can be an issue, inakомыслие. The word власть or power, власть comes from владеть. Power is not just I am in charge. Power is I own you. So it is power sitting on people and saying, go forward. And this is what's called Putin's vertical system of governing, where there are people, police, church, propaganda, bureaucrats, oligarchs, and all of that is on the money. I'm not sure why they use American flag here, whoever put this picture together, but idea, definitely dollar is very much in use and plays a big role in how Russia operates. This is very current results from Transparency International. Out of 180 countries they looked at in their corruption perception index. Russia is 138 out of 180 countries. So corruption is horrible, and in many ways it's really killing the country, because so many failures in business and in especially in business, but in politics, can be really attributed to high degree of corruption. You might remember a few years ago a big scandal around doping in during the Sochi Olympics. This is a demonstration protesting all the sanctions that were applied because of that. And the slogan here is one of very well-known Russian phrases as well, "Не пойман, не вор." If you haven't been caught, you are not a thief. There are all kinds of laws in Russian law books about stealing and punishment for it, and all kinds of consequences that can be applied to you. Russia being a country of very particularistic approach to laws, these laws are not necessarily equally applied. But the idea is, if you have not been caught, you are not a thief. Siloviki, or law enforcement, is a scary reality for Russia. Russia that has a history of KGB and all sorts of other things definitely is very sensitive to it. What's happening today is that law enforcement, any country needs a law enforcement. You cannot have a country without it. But unfortunately, the law is often used for not legitimate reasons. And siloviki, people in power, have kind of a well-established practice by now of taking businesses away from people who build them, finding some kind of a law based on which you can be put in prison and your business can be taken from you. They use pretty severe methods against people demonstrating. There are there is a law in Russia that really kind of goes against the constitution that says that every gathering has to be approved, not in terms of, yeah, you informed us and we now know to kind of watch the traffic in this area, but it's like, no, if we tell you you can't do it, you can't do it. Very recent example was when during the May Day demonstration in St. Petersburg, and that was an approved demonstration, there was a pretty severe beating done to a group of people, and they were accused because they kind of stopped, that they were trying to have a meeting within a May Day demonstration, so they were trying to have an unsanctioned event within a sanctioned event. So it's a crazy making thing for anybody who even wants to really follow Russian laws. It becomes really complicated. The word vrag or enemy is a very big thing in Russia. In Russian history, before the Soviet Union, during the Soviet Union, and now, because of the country being more of the external locus of control culture, when we find an external enemy, when we can point out whose fault it is, we don't have to deal with all sorts of things. So this, again, this is a Russian humor, definitely. You see, it's a cartoon, but it says here, the whole world is our enemy, we only believe Putin. And what is really scary is that in official statements, the words like fifth column are now used. So in the Soviet Union time, there was a diagnosis of latent schizophrenia on the books, mental health manuals. Yeah, latent schizophrenia meant you are definitely seriously mentally ill, and latent, it doesn't show in any way. So how do we know that you're ill? It is because you are not in agreement with the party line, and based on the diagnosis of latent schizophrenia, people were put into mental institutions for years and years. So this new wording is fifth column, identifying enemies. Yeah, enemies of the state phrase is used again in Russian propaganda. This is one of those enemies of the state, Alexei Navalny, who is trying to fight against Russian corruption. He has a whole organization that fights with corruption. He tried to be a candidate in Russian election because they accused him in some very strange thing that even, it was a long story. So he was accused in stealing something that wasn't even stolen, and based on that, he now cannot be eligible for elections, but he can definitely can be an opposition politician. So this is him in the crowd, and as you see, Siloviki are right there. This is him with a green face. In Russia, there is this thing that's called zelenka, or kind of a green liquid that is used for, I don't know, if you have a scratch, you will put it on as ointment, something like that. And in Russia, you can get it splashed in your face. You can get urine splashed in your face. You can have all sorts of things splashed in your face if you are not, if you're kind of inakomyslyshi, the one who thinks differently. And this is another instance, and this time it really ended up injuring him quite severely because they actually got into his eye. Some of you might know this face, Boris Nemtsov, one of very famous Russian politicians, very brave man, the man who was very much opposed to what Putin was doing. You see him in the picture here with McCain, as well as with another young man whose name is Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza is still alive. but had 2 instances of near-death experience when he was poisoned by some really crazy stuff. And Boris Nemtsov was gunned down in the middle of Moscow, as you see, pretty close to Kremlin. And this bridge is now unofficially called Nemtsov's Most, or Nemtsov's Bridge. And there is this makeshift memorial. People bring flowers and pictures, and Moscow authorities keep cleaning up this bridge every night. It is not a very comfortable role in Russia today to be a part of the politician. Here we come to friendship. The Russian words here, "добавь меня в друзья," or "make me your friend," and that's definitely, that comes from Facebook. Facebook is very, very popular in Russia. I'm not talking right now about Russians mingling in American kind of side of Facebook, but for Russians, Facebook became very popular. And right now it is actually under the question because Russian government is very strongly pushing for RUNET, or independent internet that would be for Russian use only. So Russia might be cut off in some serious way pretty soon if that really kind of comes through. Russian friendship is a wonderful friendship when you have a Russian friend. Russian culture is what's known as a coconut culture. It takes time to let you in. It takes time to decide, can you be my friend or not? Can I be your friend or not? But if you make friends with Russians, the expectation is that you will be friends for life. The Russian friend is the one you can call at 3 o'clock in the morning if you need to deal with whatever is happening in your life. It also means that as a culture that has kind of puts relationships ahead of everything else, that in Russia without connections and without friendships, many things will not happen. Definitely, you know, businesses that are trying to operate in a more Western way are trying to put task before the relationship and law before the relationships, but it is still very, very, very much a relationship-driven culture, and you need to really invest your time in building relationships if you want to be with Russians. And you need to be very careful in what you can and cannot talk about. I can do bashing of my country. I can do jokes about it. I can do, you know, whatever I want to do if I am a Russian person living in Russia. But you have to be really on a very, very, very well-established level of trust with me if you want to allow yourself something like that. And it is especially true today because, as you see, there is this big push that's never been there before. But I am a friend of Putin, hashtag я друг Путина, hashtag I'm a friend of Putin. And there is this whole movement of national liberation. I don't know what they're liberating the nation from, that pushes for, you know, we are friends of Putin. And being a friend of Putin today in Russia is important because practically not all, but main pieces of the economy today are taken over by friends of Putin. Different oligarchs that are friends of Putin, their companies get huge contracts without any competition. They're expected to get government financing, which it is making harder and harder for foreign business, harder and harder for smaller business within Russia. Foreign business is leaving, at least American and European business definitely is leaving. Chinese business is coming in. There is a lot of presence of Chinese business in Russia today. And the picture on the bottom here is another friendship with Putin, and that is Ramzan Kadyrov, who is president of Autonomic Republic of Chechnya. You might have seen this article by Masha Gessen in New Yorker about really terrible things that were happening to gay men in Chechnya. Many of them are getting political asylum now in different countries outside of Russia. Masha Gessen herself is a lesbian woman, married to another lesbian woman, and they have children together. And they left Russia a few years ago, being afraid that their children can be taken away from them as a way to control Masha, who is a very independent journalist. Masha grew up between Russia and US. She speaks equally well and writes equally well in Russian and in English, and that is the name that I suggest you kind of keep in front of your when you make your choices for next book to read. There is a book about Putin that she wrote, and the book about totalitarian system in Russia, and she really is the one who is sounding an alarm and warning the world about the danger of totalitarian regimes coming all over the place. I have a few more things to share, but I want to check on how are we doing with questions.
So Tatyana, just the two so far. I have a couple of questions for you as well for afterwards, but we can open that up in about 5 minutes or so for other folks if they have questions.
Okay, wonderful. Then I will share a couple more things here, specifically from kind of intercultural perspective. We talk a lot about cultural dimensions, and I just want you to have kind of a visceral experience of how it looks like on the ground. This is one of the books that I can highly recommend about Russia. It's written by an American businessman, actually. And the reason I got this book in the first place was that I came across this quote that Frederick Andresen has in his book. It's his words. There are always two sides to the coin, but in Russia, maybe three. So that's the Lobachevsky geometry for you. Three sides to a coin, things that can constantly surprise you, things that you would not necessarily expect. So Russia is a high context culture. Here is how high context works. This is the picture of three policemen practically carrying the guy away from the street. In Russia, the law today allows for individual protest. I can stand there with some slogan. If you come and stand next to me, we can be arrested for having an unsanctioned demonstration because there is more than one person. But as one person, I don't need any special permission. So here is the guy standing there and holding this one word up. And that's a dirty word. That's a word that you don't want your children to read necessarily. And that is the word that's a derivative of a very dirty Russian word that is often used, you know, in bad jokes about Putin. So he's taken out of the street, he's brought to the police department, and they start a criminal case against him based on the fact that he is out there kind of saying bad words about the president. There is a better way to say it in English that's not coming to me right now. And he says, what do you mean I'm saying bad words about president? Where do you see president here? And the policeman says to him, don't we all know about whom this word is now used? So that's your high context way in which somebody can be accused, arrested, and even, you know, get a real time in prison, possibly. Today, it will get even easier because they just had a new law that you can have serious consequences for disrespect to government, disrespect to authorities, disrespect to president. And as you see in this situation, anything that I want to interpret as this kind of disrespect can be interpreted. An individual protest, an article that somebody published, an opinion that somebody expressed. In Russia, there is a growing number of people who are being arrested for liking or reposting posts. You know, it can be even not mine, but because I reposted something and it shows disregard for authorities, that would be good enough. Particularistic approach to laws really can feel like a theater of absurd. Yeah, that is theater of absurd in Russia. They are arresting people based on, like, for example, the reason I use this theater of absurd, there is a really kind of big case that's been going on in Russia for a while, when a very famous theater director was arrested, put under house arrest. The director of the theater itself was put in actual arrest, actual prison, and the whole case was based on the fact that they got money from the government to put on some kind of a production, and who knows what they used this money for, because there was no production. There are all kinds of documents showing that not only this production was done, this production got all kinds of acclaims. There are lots and lots of things that are written by critics about the success of that particular production. Absolutely does not matter. It's not about the production, it's not about money. You can be as corrupt as you want to, as long as you are corrupt in the right way, as long as you are not saying something that shows that you are inakomyslyshi, that you are in some kind of a disagreement with whatever the party line is at the moment. This is how external locus of control works. President Putin once a year has this open phone line with his people. It's televised, it goes on for a few hours. He is a man of great stamina, so he stays on screen for a few hours in a row. They collect questions from people before it. So a couple years ago, those were the numbers. 2 million people submitted their questions beforehand. 1,100,000 called in with their questions at the time. He actually took 68 questions, and that's where manual control comes in. If somebody is fortunate enough to be a part of these 68 questions, and the person says, I'm calling you from this place and we haven't had hot water for 3 years, there will be hot water there in a couple of days. Everything will be fixed. But what do you do if you cannot call president directly to get your hot water fixed, or to get your salary paid, or to get anything else that you need to be done to be actually done? In Russia, they refer to it as ручное управление, or literally manual control. And the system there, speaking of external locus of control, everything has to be controlled, everything has to be heavily controlled. And maybe just this one thing to celebrate Russian humor. You know, there is this phrase to step on the same reiki. It's very much used in Russia a lot. So this person says, не надоело наступать на одни и те же грабли? Aren't you tired of stepping on the same reiki again? And the other person says, yeah, let's get new reiki. So we'll keep stepping on it, but we will get new reiki. And unfortunately, that's what's happening a lot. And the last thing about generations, just to finish with it, this says children are our future. And that is a picture from a couple years ago. And that is the final thing that I want to say here. Society's destiny rests on how it treats its children. And it's true for children anywhere. What our children are exposed to, what do they experience, how much of adversity they experience, how much of propaganda they experience, what are they being taught, what becomes normal for them, because this is how culture keeps going. We teach our children what is a kind of, this is the way how we do things here. And that gets transmitted through our children. So, question.
Tatyana, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. So we have about 10 minutes or so for any Q&A. So if anybody would like to either put something in the chat box or unmute your phone, this is the time.
Use your chance. Give me a chance to argue with you. You know, that's what Russians do. We like to argue. Sounds like somebody is unmuting maybe, or at least there is something in the chat.
Yes, so we have Barb Galen, who said, fabulous, very interesting presentation, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I have a question, if we'll
Sure.
give folks a couple minutes as well, but I'm interested in this concept of inakomosli, is that how it's pronounced?
Inakomyslyshi.
Inakomosli, okay.
The person who thinks.
Business context, people, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we were all muted for just 1 second.
So how would, in a business context, since dissent is viewed so negatively and is just not done, how would people express disagreement?
You know, it's really hard. It very much depends on what kind of a boss you have. If you know your boss as being vindictive, if you know your boss as somebody who will look for, you know, whose fault it is when something goes wrong, the people would tend to create Potemkin's village and not report on what's really happening, but to just keep a boss happy. And that is done on the level of the business. It can be done on the level of the government. You know, Putin definitely doesn't get everything he, you know, that will make him unhappy. If you have a boss, which also, you know, it's, people are different. You know, there are some absolutely wonderful bosses in Russia. If you have a boss who, you know, will have your back, sort of, People will say everything that they have to say. They will be very open. The difference of opinion in Russia happens very differently. We are very passionate people. If I have an idea, I tend to be passionately married to it. So I might not necessarily do a lot of listening in the brainstorming situation, because I know that your idea is bad because mine is good. You know, we can make a comment like, you know, never heard anything so stupid, in just, you know, brainstorming with each other. So letting go of one's own idea and opening yourself to somebody else's ideas is not something that comes easily to people in any geography, but definitely for Russians, it's hard. It's hard. We are very, if I believe I'm right, I'm passionately right.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tatyana. So we have a few questions that have come in. A question from Namita Evaloy. What is the biggest misunderstanding Americans have of Russians?
I think Americans tend to see Russians as a monolith. Russian culture is tremendously diverse. It's diverse ethnically, it's diverse religiously, it's diverse generationally, it's diverse in its ideas. It is a country that is difficult for its own people. It is also a country that in this age of technology succeeded in brainwashing a lot of its people, you know. I am not a big fan of people who only take their news from Fox News and that is the only truth for them. But I'm also not a big fan of people who take all of their news only from MSNBC and that becomes the only thing for them. So in Russia, Russians refer to TV, which is owned mostly by the government, as zombie box. And unfortunately, it's been quite successful in many places to do that. And at the same time, you can find whatever you want on Russian internet, a lot of kind of freedom of exchange and all sorts of things. So Russia in many ways is the country of contradiction. Anything you know about it, the complete opposite is usually also true about it.
Yeah, great, thank you. We also have a question from John DeVries on how can we use the values and cultural foundations to help non-Russians interact successfully with Russians and Russian business?
I think that the things to understand is how Russians deal with relationships, with hierarchy, with, you know, where the locus of control is, how you build trust, again, that it is very much a coconut culture and not a peach culture as United States tend to be. Trust takes longer to build, but when you get it, you know, it's yours. And also understanding of the reality of just Russian business. You know, there are sanctions, there are things that Russian businesses can do or cannot do. There are all kinds of complications that maybe were not there a few years ago that are very much there now. There is a reality of a brain drain. There is a reality of, again, controls that are put more and more over the internet. And if you are communicating with somebody in Russia, you better learn and you do it quickly how to communicate between the lines and read messages between the lines rather than in direct lines, because Russians have, it's a Russian art to communicate between the lines. It goes back to 18th century and 19th century, and how do you say what you say without being accused for saying it. You know, it's Americans who are more used to what I have to say, I'll put it in direct lines, sometimes have a hard time communicating with Russians this way. And also one big difference, when Americans say no, they usually mean no. When Russians say no, it is usually keep talking. So it is not a closed door at all. It's just an invitation to explore more creative options.
Great, thank you. And that actually, we have a couple minutes left. That sort of segues into a question that Karen had, which was actually in agreement with my question about dissent. She says, I find faculty members from Russia tend to be very persistent, even when repeatedly explaining that something just cannot be done. Would you say that this is, would you say that is because of needing for persistence to succeed? So if you could perhaps elaborate even a little bit more on that, why no does not necessarily mean no.
You know, if you ever go to Cultural Detective online, which I can highly recommend, go to culturaldetective.com and explore it. You will find Cultural Detective Russia, of which I am a co-author, and you will see there that one of the values that we identified for Russia is perseverance. You know, where you know, Russians always find a way around. Russians find a way to make things work, including making you believe that something will never work. Yeah, if this is my position, I will insist on it. And quite often, if it is about anything that has to do with Russia, definitely pay more attention to it, because, for example, Russians always saw Americans as naive. Now I think Americans are becoming even more naive in Russian perspective. And the part of American naivete is American belief in laws. If there is a law, it will be followed. If there is a rule in business, it will be followed. We know it's not always true in the United States. We know that it is much more complicated. But comparing to how Russian laws are used and how Russian laws are followed or not followed, absolutely, Americans do nothing but following laws 24 hours a day in comparison to, you know, how things are going in Russia. In US, you know, the court kind of follows the law. In Russia, court follows more who called the judge. So especially when it is you and the government that are involved in this. So it's a very complicated place, but understanding what it is that they are insisting on, and instead of having kind of head-on collusion, I would suggest kind of tell me more, help me understand why you see it this way, because that can allow then for some exploration of what exactly the person is talking about.
Wonderful. Well, Tatyana, thank you so much for this incredibly informative insider's perspective of Russia, both historically and contemporary. Thanks to everybody who's participated today in our webinar. Once again, this will be recorded for members, so we'll have that on the website, and we'll also have the slide deck available as well. And I just want to reiterate that if anybody does have an interesting topic that you think might be of interest to SIETAR members, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can have a discussion about it. We'll have our next webinar in June, and want to wish everybody a great day.
Wonderful. If you have more questions, connect with me on LinkedIn, or send me an email, or go to my website, connectingdifferences.com, and send me a message from there. Thank you all.
Okay, bye.